Hey friends, I hope this video finds you all doing well and in good spirits. I've got a few things I need to cover here, so I'm going to kind of get right into it. First of all, I want to assure everybody that with what I'm doing, what XJW Elder's wife, Jane Doe, is doing, we're not here to destroy anybody's faith. But the thing is your faith cannot be lost if it's not built upon a solid foundation to begin with. And I know that in the world of Christendom, Jehovah's Witnesses included, you all think that the Bible is built upon a solid foundation. And unless you spend time doing research, critical research, and examining a whole lot of things, and ultimately being honest with yourself, you're going to recognize that the book that you've been taught to put all your faith and hope in just isn't such a book. Now, if some of you friends have been watching XJW Elder's wife's Jane Doe's videos recently, you will see that she is trying to make everything gel per se, and quite honestly, you can't do that, not with the Bible, because as much as Watchtower likes to make you question whether the Bible is God's word or man's word, ultimately, with the proper study and research, it is man's word. And I'm going to illustrate that. But before I do that, I want to read something from the book, The Old Testament, by Michael Coogan. And it's regarding King David, because what I'm going to read is something that's written from two different perspectives, okay? And if you don't know what these two perspectives are, you're never going to find the honesty you need to sit back and say, wow, this really is man's word. And that's brought out here, okay, on page 444, under the subheading David, right here. I'll be reading this right here. We get a good example of the chronicler's methods by comparing his perception of David with that of the Deuteronomistic historians. And they're going to compare 1 Samuel 6, chapter 16 through 31 and 2 Samuel 1, and also Kings 1 through chapter 2. Going on, omitting all of the material in 1 Samuel except for the account of Saul's death in battle against the Philistines in 1 Chronicles 10. The chronicler begins his narrative about David with the account of his anointing as king over all Israel. Now, I just want to pause there for a moment. We have to recognize that as you read these scriptures, you have to mentally separate the 10-tribe northern kingdom with the 2-tribe Judean kingdom, which is really the Jews. And that's why a lot of times when you read these stories, they seem to contradict. And they actually do, because, as it mentioned, you have the chronicler's perspective. But this chronicler omits something that's very important when he's making it look like David was anointed over the entire 12 tribes, which was not true. There again, depending on whose perspective you're reading it from. Going on, although the chronicler is aware that David ruled first in Hebron and then in Jerusalem, he does not mention that at Hebron David was king initially only of Judea and not of the 10 northern tribes. For the chronicler, Israel was always a unified entity. Okay, now that's all I'm going to read because it's just going to get long in length. Now, the same thing takes place when you are reading in Samuel versus Chronicles about the Satan being the one that causes David to sin, or Jehovah is the one causing David to sin, because you have two different writers. One of them is very pro-Yahweh, and the other one looks at the Satan as causing David to sin. So I'm going to be reading on page 475 in this box right in through here. I know it's kind of, there we go, in that box. This is where I'm going to be reading from. I'm going to read part of the first paragraph so you can kind of get a baseline of what we're going to be getting into here. In Job, chapters 1 through 2, appears a figure called the Satan, which means something like the accuser, or following the forensic metaphors that are employed throughout the book, the prosecutor. Okay? He is a member of the divine council, the sons of God, who appears periodically before Yahweh. The word Satan means adversary, either military or legal. Okay, so I'm going to skip down to the next paragraph because this is important. The last example is especially enlightening, for it points to the development of the figure of Satan. I'm going to pronounce it Satan instead of Satan for the sake of Christianity. In 2 Samuel 24:1, the source for 1 Chronicles 21:1, it is Yahweh himself who incites David to take the census. In revising his source, apparently troubled by this attribution of temptation and sin to the deity, the author of Chronicles transfers the blame to a Satan. Only in later Jewish and Christian traditions would this shadowy figure develop into the familiar devil, with attributes taken from other biblical narratives, such as the serpent in the garden, Eden, and the day star who fell from heaven. So once again, it depends on whose perspective that you're reading these Bible books that it appears, and there are contradictions. Now I'm going to illustrate it like this. Now, all of you friends that watch both this channel and XJW Elder's wife, Jane Doe, you will know that my mother is an uber-duber Jehovah's Witness who loves the governing body and who loves Watchtower. You will also know that if you watch XJW Elder's wife, Jane Doe's channel, you will know that she has a daughter that is an uber-duber Jehovah's Witness and just loves the governing body and loves the Watchtower. So, if you were to take myself and Jane Doe and sit us at a table, and on the opposite end of the table have my mother and Jane Doe's daughter, and we are assigned to write, just say, a 10-page letter regarding Anthony Morris, the governing body Anthony Morris. How do you think, from two different perspectives, that story is going to turn out? You're exactly right. Jane Doe and I are going to crucify Tony Morris. We're even going to say he can't be one of the anointed. He can't be one of the people that are going to rule with Jesus for 1,000 years. The man's delusional. The man is responsible, being at the table of an organization that has put to death millions, if not more, Jehovah's Witnesses because of a failed blood policy. Whereas my mother and Jane Doe's daughter are going to only write beautiful things about Tony Morris. They're going to overlook the fact that Tony Morris is a drunkard. We all saw the video going into Bottle King and buying all that alcohol. But see, here's the thing. My mother, Jane Doe's daughter's never even going to look at that. So they don't even know to put that in the writing. And even if they did, they would apologetically make an excuse for that behavior. Just like when Tony Morris gave that talk about human hot dogs, during Armageddon, all those that oppose Jehovah, aka Tony Morris, they're going to become like human hot dogs. But you take those two conflicting stories and run that for another 500 years into the future. What do you think that story is going to look like then? Well, the same thing has happened with the Bible. Depending on whose perspective you're reading, you're going to get contradictions because it's truly and absolutely a human book. And this book has opposing sides all the way through it. If you got a Bible handy, go to Matthew chapter 22. And we're going to read verses 31 and 32. Now, with the proper research, you're going to come to recognize that there was a man in a scene that came out of the desert that had opposing religious views from the scribes and the Pharisees. That's why on one occasion he points the finger and says, "You are from your father, the devil." And if you know what to look for, you can see these opposing views. So the writer of Matthew, this is what Matthew writes. And these words allegedly coming out of Jesus' mouth, because this portion of Matthew is very pro-Jesus. Matthew 22, 31 and 32. And this is answering the question about the resurrection. And in the resurrection, this woman has 7 husbands. Whose wife will she be? So dropping down to verse 31. As regards the resurrection of the dead, did you not read what was spoken? That's the key word. Spoken to you by God, saying, "I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." He is the God not of the dead, but of the living. So when Jesus is doing this, or whoever this person is, this Essene doing this, he is letting the, Matthew is letting the audience know that the Israelites have heard God speak. So let's go over to John chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 37 through 39. Now, once again, presumably, this is Jesus speaking. But this time, listen to what Jesus says. In Matthew, the Israelites heard God speak. The spoken voice, the word. Okay, John 5, verse 37. Also, the Father who sent me has himself borne witness about me. You have neither heard his voice at any time, nor seen his figure, and you do not have his word remaining in you, because the very one whom he dispatched you do not believe. You are searching the scriptures, because you think that by means of them you will have everlasting life. And these are the very ones that bear witness about me. And yet you do not want to come to me that you may have life. And there again, there's the contradiction in ideologies, because the desert dwelling Essenes were definitely in opposition to the priesthood that's in Jerusalem. Now, there's something else that you want to pay attention to. Let's go to the book of Exodus, chapter 4, and verse 10. So whoever is writing this is making it look like Moses. Well, let's just read it. Moses now said to Jehovah. Moses now said? I thought Moses wrote Exodus, so this should really be in the first person, shouldn't it, friends? But it's not. So someone else is writing this. And from his perspective, this is what he states. Excuse me, Jehovah, but I am not a fluent speaker, neither since yesterday, nor since before that, nor since your speaking to your servant, for I am slow of mouth and slow of tongue. Okay, let's go over to Acts chapter 7. Now we're going to read verse 22. Consequently, Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. In fact, he was powerful in his words and deeds. Friends, I didn't write this. If your faith is not based on a solid foundation, then this shouldn't be so earth-shattering to you. So whoever is writing Acts, which presumably is the Dr. Luke, is now saying, fact, Moses was powerful in words, in deeds, but yet whoever is writing Exodus is making Moses look weak. You have two different writers. It's not the inspired word of God. It is the word of man. And I'm going to go on a little bit further with that, because this is where it gets really disturbing. Okay, friends? We all know that in Christendom that they all love King David. And in fact, in some people's minds, the only wrong King David ever did was sleep with another man's wife, get her pregnant, and he conspired to have him killed. That's the end of the story. He actually tried to get Bathsheba to get Uriah drunk so that he would sleep with her and cover the sin. That didn't happen. When you talk to anybody in Christendom, and in particular Jehovah's Witnesses, they're going to equate that storyline with the blood guilt that's associated with David from God for not being allowed to build the temple. I'm going to challenge that, because in particular Jehovah's Witnesses and Watchtowers not going to really focus on what I'm going to do, because then it becomes too obvious as to what's going on. It really does. And that whole story about David being blood guilty for the death of Uriah, I believe is a red herring, a distraction, gaslighting, I dare say. Okay, if you got your Bible, go to 2 Samuel chapter 16. Now, before I get into this, I want your friends to also recognize something, that while King Saul was alive and still king of Israel, David was king of Judah. You have, presumably, in the storyline, all of Israel singing this grandiose song about Saul killing his thousands of Philistines and David killing his tens of thousands of Philistines. And they're presumably singing this song while Saul is still alive, while Saul is king. And yet, if David truly was killing his tens of thousands of Philistines, then why is it when you read the story, David is in the rear lines of the Philistine king, ready to do battle against Saul? I mean, either that Philistine king was living under a rock, or this song really didn't happen until much, much later in history and then backdated. in my opinion, you cannot have everybody singing this grandiose song about David killing all of these tens of thousands of Philistines and yet being aligned with the Philistine king ready to do battle. But see, when you read the storyline closer, the Philistine kings didn't trust David, and the Philistine king sent David away. So you have contradictions in the storyline. It doesn't make sense, but once again, you're reading it from two different writers, just like the illustration of Toni Morris. Jane Doe and I are going to write one perspective. My mother and her daughter is going to write it from another perspective. You put the two together and they're going to contradict. Which one is the truth? Well, in my opinion, the one that does the more harm is the more truthful story. Okay, 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 5. We got a problem here, guys. Okay? And King David came as far as Bahurim. And look, coming out from there was a man of the family of Saul's house. And his name was Shimei, the son of Gera, coming out and calling down evil as he came out. And he began throwing stones at David and at all the servants of King David. And all the people and all the mighty men were at his right and at his left. And this is what Shimei said as he called down evil. Get out, you blood-guilty man, and good-for-nothing man. Jehovah has brought back upon you all the blood guilt for the house of Saul, in place of whom you have ruled as king. And Jehovah gives the kingship into the hand of Absalom, your son. And here you are in your calamity, because you are a blood-guilty man. Okay? Verse 9. Finally, Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog call down evil upon my lord and king? Let him go over, please, and take off his head. But the king, now remember, this is King David. But the king said, what do I have to do with you men, you sons of Zeruiah? Thus let him call down evil, because Jehovah himself has said to him, meaning Shimei, call down evil upon David. So who should say, why did you do that way? See, King David right there acknowledges that the words coming out of Shimei for the blood guilt of the family line of Saul is upon David. And when you've been watching what XJW Elder's wife, Jane Doe, has been doing in this matter, you will see that King David broke promises and slain all of the legitimate, rightful heirs to the throne of Israel that rightfully belonged to King Saul. So now, let's go to 1 Kings, and we're going to look at chapter 2. And we're going to be reading verses 36 through 46. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to kind of skip so you can get the context, okay? If you look over at verse 29, then King Solomon was told. So, this story has taken place in the presence of King Solomon, okay? Verse 36, finally the king sent and called Shimei and said to him, build yourself a house in Jerusalem, and you must dwell there and not go out from there to this place and that. Now, I'm going to just kind of tell you what's going on all the way up to verse 46. Remember, Shimei is from the house of Saul. In this writer's perspective, Shimei is the legal blood heir to the throne of Saul. What you see happening here in 1 Kings is that Shimei, the last heir to the house of Saul, is now made captive in Jerusalem. He can build a house, and as long as he stays within the prison of Jerusalem and never leave, he can live his life. But if he leaves, he will be killed. And to avoid the blood guilt, they tell Shimei that if you do leave, the blood guilt is upon you. And that's no different than a prisoner escaping a jail and being shot in the back while escaping. Is it really the guard's fault, or is it the fault of the person escaping? We've got this same situation going on right here. But it's important to recognize what's really going on, because in one chronicler's view, King David was always the king over the 12 tribes. In another writer's view, David was only king at first Hebron and then Jerusalem, Judea. So David, depending on who you read it from, was never the king of all 12 tribes. And the other writer says he was king over the 12 tribes. But I want to read verse 46 because, well, I'll start at verse 45. But King Solomon will be blessed, and the throne of David itself will prove to be firmly established before Jehovah forever. With that, the king commanded Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, who then went out and fell upon him so that he died. What you're seeing is you're seeing the death of Shimei, since he left the confinement walls of Jerusalem. And the blood guilt is obviously on Shimei. But Shimei really went out to go retrieve 2 runaway slaves. So depending on who you're reading from and what perspective you decide to take, Shimei really had a legitimate reason for leaving the confines of the prison Jerusalem. The thing is, friends, is that when you look at the curse that Shimei put upon King David, all the blood guilt for the house of Saul was put upon David, because Saul broke his promises to keep Saul's children, grandchildren alive. Now you have the last remaining heir, Shimei, from the house of Saul, being put to death. Being put to death. The last heir is now dead. Look at what this writer now writes. And the kingdom was firmly established in the hand of Solomon. That's when, according to the writer of 1 Kings, the 12 tribes were united, not under David, but under Solomon. There's another point I wish to bring out. Go down to chapter 3. And Solomon proceeded to form a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and to take Pharaoh's daughter and to bring her to the city of David until he finished building his own house and the house of Jehovah and Jerusalem's wall all around. There's a problem with this statement, because did Solomon never read the scriptures that Moses wrote that says, do not forge marriage alliances with the people of the nations? But yet Solomon does. He forges a marriage alliance with the daughter of Pharaoh, almost as if the Levitical law, the Mosaic law, wasn't in existence yet. Read carefully, friends. Read carefully. Now, just talking a little bit more about Shimei, in the Interpreter's Bible Dictionary, under Shimei, pretty much says the same thing that I just read. A Benjaminite descendant of Gera. He belonged to the family of the house of Saul, which had lost the kingship to David. When David was fleeing Jerusalem before the revolt of Absalom at Bahurim, on the way to the Jordan, Shimei cursed David and threw stones at him. Shimei voiced the protest latent in some Benjaminite quarters that David had supplanted the house of Saul, and he charged David with blood guilt. David prevented the killing of Shimei, taking the words of Shimei as sent by Yahweh and hoping that Yahweh would balance the curse with eventual blessings. After the revolt of Absalom was over, Shimei with 1,000 Benjaminites rushed to be among the first to meet David as he was about to cross the Jordan on his return to Jerusalem. He begged forgiveness, and David, with an oath, granted royal clemency on the occasion of Yahweh's grace reestablishing his reign. One of David's deathbed charges to Solomon was that he removed the curse of Shimei, which still rested upon David's house and threatened the secure establishment of his dynasty. See, the thing is as long as Shimei was blood relative to Saul, he could legitimately claim the kingship. Going on. David's oath of clemency was not binding upon Solomon, and he was to watch for an opportunity to eradicate the curse by killing Shimei, or in other words, to eradicate the legitimate bloodline of King Saul. Okay, going on. Solomon commanded Shimei to remain in Jerusalem, telling him that if he left Jerusalem on any pretext, it would mean his death, and Shimei agreed. 3 years later, Shimei violated his oath by going to Gath to bring back 2 runaway slaves. Thus freed from all taboos regarding Shimei, Solomon, upon his return, executed him, which ended, seemingly, the legitimate bloodline of the royal house of Saul. That kingdom was stolen like any other kingdom upon this earth. That's why I find it very, very curious to find the Apostle the Apostle Paul stating later that, well, God didn't abandon his people Israel, did he? May that never be, because I'm an Israelite from the tribe of Benjamin. Is Paul claiming that royal bloodline of Saul once again? Inquiring minds want to know. Now, bear in mind, friends, by way of illustration, everything you read in the Bible does not have to be necessarily true, even though a historical figure is identified. Going back to a previous video regarding Caiaphas, at that time in history, the writer writing that story and placing Jesus in front of Caiaphas knew that Caiaphas was the priest in Israel, Jerusalem at that time, because they later discovered the bone box. But just because Caiaphas was a real live living human being does not necessarily mean that the Jesus standing in front of him was the Son of God. There again, you have the priestly line in Jerusalem and the Essenes in the desert at conflict with each other. So it's very likely that anybody who was in the scene could have been before Caiaphas on this trial. A really good way to illustrate this is just because Henry McCarty was a real-life living human being doesn't mean the story that... Oh, wait a minute. You may not recognize the name Henry McCarty. Henry McCarty later became better known as Billy the Kid. Now, we all know from historical resources that Billy the Kid was a real-life living human being. So just because Hollywood decides to make a movie and entitle it Billy the Kid Meets Frankenstein does not make the Frankenstein monster a real-life living character, does it? So just because when you read these Bible stories you may have what appears to be a real-life living human being, it does not make the story authentic. Does not make the story real. It does not make the Jesus in front of Caiaphas the Son of God. Here again, friends, I've laid out a whole lot of things in this video. Don't accuse me of trying to destroy your faith or making you lose your faith, because I showed your faith is not built upon a solid foundation. It's built upon the words of men with conflicting ideas, conflicting viewpoints. Whose viewpoint is actually right? That's for you to decide. I know for myself and XJW Elder's wife, Jane Doe, and a whole lot of other people on YouTube doing what I'm doing, our viewpoints, we believe, are based. A lot of it's based in mythology, religious concepts that no longer hold true. There again, when you Jehovah's Witnesses in particular are watching your governing body sit down and, reread a prayer of David in the book of Psalms, you all view David as a hero. The only blood guilt that you come to learn about David is his contriving to have Uriah murdered to cover his sin. But yet look at what Shimei is saying. David's blood guilty for wiping out the house of Saul, who is his father-in-law. He murdered family to become king. That's nothing short of greed, isn't it, friends? Because he wasn't just happy ruling over Jerusalem and the two tribes. Oh, no, 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 no. King David wanted the entire universe. And because Christendom advocates David from that perspective, he does. He rules the universe right through the pages of the Bible. And yet, I can't help but wonder why Christianity would want a legal heir such as Jesus sitting on that throne when that throne doesn't legitimately belong to David. It only belongs to David through murder and blood guilt. Shimei says that, and yet David doesn't kill Shimei because David recognizes what's coming out of Shimei's mouth is being inspired of Jehovah. Think these things through, friends. It's really not that hard. But you've got to have the working knowledge. And more importantly, you have to have self-honesty. So friends, thanks for watching. I hope that you can glean something from this. If nothing else, I really hope that it encourages a whole lot more of you to do in-depth study, in-depth research. I myself, and I know for a fact Jane Doe, are not trying to make anybody atheists. We have to seriously question, how is it that you come to believe that your faith is built on a solid foundation when all I've done is just read the Bible itself and point out what your religious leaders won't point out. So thanks for watching and have a wonderful week. Bye.